Hello everybody, welcome back to ReaperMinisTV. We're going to start off this episode with a miniature that's newly released in the P65 line, but it was also recently released in the Dark Heaven Legends line. This is Skorg Ironskull, a Fire Giant King, and the regular Dark Heaven Legends release of the miniature was $50. This time around, as a P65 miniature, it's $36. It's the same miniature either way. The difference is the composition of the metal, or I guess the formula of the metal, but it's white metal versus a more lead alloy in the P65 line, but you're saving up almost $15, actually about $14, going the P65 route. Now, in my mind, it's worth $50. The Dark Heaven Legends version of the model, it is hefty. This one is just as hefty. Comes with all the same pieces. I think it's really just a matter of taste of whether you want the white metal version or the more lead-based version, and also if you want to save 14, 15 bucks or so. So great miniature. I'm using this one as a giant in a Warriors of Chaos army that I'm building for Warhammer Fantasy Battle, using as many metal Reaper miniatures as I can, and I think I can get about 95-96% all Reaper metal. But anyway, as a fire giant, it's an awesome miniature. He's got a hella big sword that he's resting on his shoulder. Get it in the P65 line version if you want to save 14 bucks. Otherwise, the Dark Heaven Legends is still available. Either way, very good miniature here. Next up, we have a miniature for the Timberthill faction for Warlord. This is a Sildoran Protector, and it looks a lot like just a large tree man, and there's a couple others that Reaper makes treemen that I'll talk about in a second, but this guy here is definitely larger than ogre-sized in terms of his height, and it comes with 2 arms. Looks like it'll be very easy to put together. Lots of nice tree and bark and little bits of foliage detail on the figure itself. One of the arms is more like a large spiked club, and the other has the branches sticking off it almost like a hand, I guess as much of a hand as a treeman can have. Now for Timberthill players for Warlord, obviously this is pretty much a no-brainer to drop in the army, but if you're playing Warhammer Fantasy Battle and you have a Wood Elf army, he might be a little bit tall for a tree kin, but as a tree man, I think he'd be perfect. Now, a couple other options Reaper has for treemen, if you want to port them over to a Warhammer Fantasy Battle army, are 2 versions of a treeman they have called Mossbeard. The first is listed as an elven monster, and the second is just called Mossbeard the treeman, and he comes with a dryad that you could probably drop into an Wood Elf army also. And then you have this giant guy here called the Spirit of the Forest that I think would make a really good centerpiece for a Wood Elf army in Warhammer. For these next 3 miniatures, I'll be using all of them in that Warriors of Chaos army I'm building, but there's definitely other uses for them. The first one is a Barbarian Axeman from the Icingstead faction of Warlord. He's a single-piece miniature that's a little bit taller than a normal human-sized miniature would be, and I think that's partly due to, in the Icingstead army, they have some maybe half-giant or figures that are human of some mixed blood, maybe have some giant blood in them, so it's appropriate for them to be a little bit taller. And for me, using him in a Warriors of Chaos army as maybe the leader of a band of marauders, I think will be okay. But he's wearing furs and skins and carrying a large 2-handed axe. Not a whole lot of cleaning necessary on the figure. There was a little bit of flash in a couple places, or a little bit of extra metal, but really nothing significant. And in addition to my use for him, I think he'd also be perfect just as a Barbarian player character in D&D, or maybe as a pit fighter in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. So as a player character, I think he'd be great. In an Icingstead army, he'd be great. And then if you're playing another kind of mass fantasy game like Warhammer, I think you could find a pretty reasonable use for him there like I did. The second of these 3 is a low Templar. He's from the Pathfinder line. It's also a single-piece miniature, and he's carrying a 2-handed axe sort of resting on his right shoulder. There's a helmet that's slung over on his back, and also a very large kite shield that's strapped to his back. Now, he's in significantly heavier armor than the Barbarian Axeman. And for this guy, obvious use as a player character also, and I'll be dropping him into my Chaos army. I could also see him as a knight on foot in a Bretonnian army I've got. I don't think he'd be too far off from meeting that kind of role. The helmet might be a little bit off, but he's not wearing it, so you don't really see that, and you could probably cut it off and smooth out the area of the shield if you wanted to just remove it altogether. There was very minimal cleaning needed on the figure, and really my only gripe with it was that the axe head was bent in the blister pack, and it was bent over, and you can see that in the video as compared to the still picture, to where it's bent, and you got to carefully put it back into place to make the haft of the two-handed axe line upright, but you got to be careful to not snap it off because it is a fairly thin piece of metal there, so you just want to be extra careful. And then last of these three is a female warrior named Twyla, and she's listed as being a Hellborn warrior, so in D&D you would probably get a good use out of her as a tiefling, whether as a player character or as an enemy NPC kind of character. She's carrying a Morningstar in her right hand and has a shield in her left, and in sort of an open pose where she's ready for combat but not in an action-oriented kind of pose. She's not wearing a whole lot in the way of armor. She is quite buxom or voluptuous and showing a lot of that off. She has some metal plates up on her shoulders and on her arms and then down on her legs, but her midsection and a lot of her chest is bare. True to her nature as a Hellborn, or as a tiefling if you will, you can see she's got large horns that sweep back on her head, and also her legs are more in that cloven hoofed sort of style rather than regular humanoid legs. Next up we have a couple of fire beetles. You get two in the blister pack, but they come cast together on a single sprue, so you'll need to clip them off, and then also on the underside of the sprue you'll need to clean off or shave off some of the metal from the casting process to get them to lie flat. And we're going to wrap up this episode with a couple of Chronoscope releases. First is a female superheroine called Silver Marksman, and immediately I started thinking of Hawkeye or Green Arrow, depending on if you're a Marvel or DC person. She's carrying a longbow in her left hand and looks like she's drawing an arrow out of a quiver with her right. Don't see any kind of boxing gloves or specialty arrows that you can see in there, but maybe they explode into that or spring into that kind of shape when she's firing them at somebody. But single piece miniature here. You can see there's a bit of metal from the casting process that runs down from her bow down to her left foot that you'll need to clip off and clean. She's wearing a skin-tight suit, which is pretty typical for superheroes, and a large hood, but you can see good facial features under the hood. I think she's in a good pose, required very minimal amount of cleaning except for that piece you gotta clip off, but that's really nothing, and she'd work perfect in any kind of superhero RPG or tabletop game. And then last up for this episode, we have Orangutango. He's a cyber ape, and this is a single piece miniature, and you can see he's holding onto a metal pole with his left hand and leg. Thankfully he's not a pole dancing cyber ape. And in his right appendages he's got two weapons. One is looks like a blaster rifle, and the other is some kind of laser gun maybe. The cyber part of the ape is definitely visible on his left arm and on a couple other places. Some of the wires and internal workings have been exposed, probably from some battle damage. Aside from being an orangutan or cyber ape that's carrying around a couple of blast rifles, which has a lot of character to it, he's got a facial expression that either looks like he's grimacing with a lot of pain, maybe that he just got shut up and he's gonna shoot whoever hit him, or he's really enjoying his work and he's got a smirk or a smile on his face. So either way, it adds a lot of character to the miniature, and pretty much from the minute I saw the figure in the blister, I couldn't help but thinking of Clyde the orangutan from the Clint Eastwood movies, Any Which Way You Can and Any Which Way But Loose. So to me, his name is going to be Clyde. Cleaning was pretty much limited to a mold line that was visible on the pole, so if you just scrape that clean you should be fine. And then just one thing to be wary of, and you really can't do anything about it unless you're going to put it on a larger base, since it's an elevated or slightly taller model, it is a little bit top heavy and it's a little bit heavy towards the side of the miniature where the guns are. So it's a little bit prone to falling to that side if you're not sitting it on just a perfectly flat play area. In addition to uses in a superhero game, and I think you could use him either as a superhero or a supervillain, but a big monkey with a couple of guns just screams out to be a good supervillain to me. But you could use him as a surprise in a game of Deathwatch or Rogue Trader or something like that, as a Jacaro to menace your PCs with. So I like the figure a lot, it's very fun, and it has a lot of character. Alright everybody, thanks for watching this episode of ReaperMinisTV. We'll see you next time.